First, it's great to be here.
Well, you're great to be here. Okay. So, you know why we love having you is because when science answers questions, it's awesome. It's awesome because there are answers, and it's also awesome because we can plainly and blatantly say there's lots of we're not sure's, right? So, what I wanted to do today is just ask you some typical questions that I get from parents, and we're gonna wrap it in hope. How can science help us with hope? Because since you are an MRI specialist, FASD in the brain, moms and dads all over the place want to know, can the FASD brain grow? Are they plateaued, capped? Is this it? Is all this work that I'm doing, is it any of it gonna pay off? Yeah, let's start there. Not a big
Yeah.
deal. Let's just start off with the heavy stuff.
Sure. So in sort of typical brain growth, the brain grows in size until you're well, okay. Overall brain size only grows until about 6 or 7 years old. But within the brain, there's so many changes happening, and the proportional size of different parts of the brain keeps changing even into your 30s. So brain growth is a really long process for typical kids, and it's potentially even longer for kids who are not neurotypical. So kids like kids with FASD. But the brain, even after you get into the 30s, the brain is still plastic. It can still change. You can still learn new things, form new habits, and your brain is still adapting to that. So that we call that plasticity, brain plasticity.
Okay, okay. So if we're going there, awesome. That's a great segue. Neuroplasticity, because you hear it. I'm going to tell you what I hear, and then you're going to tell me if all of that is wrong or what I'm thinking. Okay. So here's how I think, neuroplasticity, like you said, the brain grows, can make new connections, all that good stuff. But then I'm under the understanding that prenatal alcohol exposure, prenatal trauma, all affects the development of the brain.
Mhm.
If the injury occurs during development, and say there's a part of the brain that is impaired or, not there or severely, can they still be neuroplasticity involved in that? Does that make sense? Like when you
Yeah.
have a stroke victim or someone who
Yeah.
incurs a brain injury,
Yes.
and is able to do that, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So the brain is always plastic. It's more plastic when you're young. So in some ways, that's a really positive thing. If you have an injury when you're young, the brain can potentially adapt to it more easily than if you or I had an injury when we're
I'm a lost cause
significantly
now. That's
older.
true. That's true.
So, but in other ways, it's concerning because there's an injury that happens during development, which has then a long time to influence. But really, I think what we're learning about now with FASD of brain development is that it's sometimes a little bit slower, sometimes a little bit faster than typical development, but development is still proceeding in the way that it should.
Okay. Let's unpack this because parents really want to know. Now, you're not just coming out here claiming this stuff. You've actually did a study, right?
Right.
You did a study. Can you tell us about the study, a little
Yeah.
bit about what you found so that you're saying, yes, it does grow differently? Look, go ahead. Awesome.
Hmm. So we've been looking a lot recently at younger kids with prenatal alcohol exposure. Many of them haven't been diagnosed with FASD yet, but I'm talking about kids between about 3 and 8 years old. And what we see in those little kids in terms of a variety of different brain measures is that the brain is going in the direction it should. Okay. Just same as the unexposed kids. But the kids with alcohol exposure, their brains are changing a bit slower. So they're still going up when they should be going up. It's just happening a bit more slowly, which if we
Which,
link this back to brain plasticity, probably means that there's less brain plasticity in those kids with alcohol exposure. Not zero. It's absolutely not zero.
right. Just
There's
not happening at the speed of
exactly.
neurotypical because of the cascading effect, right? Of the prenatal alcohol exposure and other things. Okay, okay. So the variability of this then, you found that the FASD brain grows differently than a neurotypical individual.
Mhm. That's right. And then interestingly, when you look at older kids with FASD, so now I'm talking like 8 to 20 kind of age range, There's some evidence, there's not a lot of research yet, but there's some evidence that it might be faster, like perhaps in a little bit of a sort of catch-up phase
And when is that?
through the teen years.
Okay, so then anecdotally, we find or found around 30 or so, and maybe it's not a catch up or it kind of is because if the developmental timeline is like this, could we say a 30-year-old is now functioning younger, but it's still older? Like, does that make sense? Because that's we hear that from parents when they get
Mhm.
older, things calm down and they're like, boom, here we go. Is that because the executive functioning, is developed? Like, this is what
Yeah. So in terms of brain development, I think we can characterize it as a little bit slower overall and a little bit behind. So it's happening more gradually. It's going to take longer to get to the same place. And the endpoint might be slightly different. So the mature FASD brain might still not look exactly like a mature neurotypical brain in terms of very subtle measurements that we can get and very subtle ways that it works. On a gross level, they look almost identical.
a
You
few
you wouldn't be able to tell, Jeff, if I gave you a whole bunch of pictures of FASD
Christ.
brains and
Okay,
not.
because you do MRI, right? That's how
That's right.
you get your information, your data, right?
Right.
You're straight up at a hospital, aren't you?
Yep. Yep. The Alberta Children's Hospital.
Yeah, and you're doing a study and MRI, and that's where we would hear from families who either were denied MRI to look at the brain or they found nothing, and it leaves a parent frustrated. And you have said in the past, and for our newer listeners, we could reiterate that's because a singular MRI, for the most part, can't diagnose or won't show any of those brain variations.
In the vast majority of cases of FASD, particularly where there's no other concern of epilepsy or, some other
Uh-huh.
disorder, we don't see any differences that you can pick up with the eye. Like you're not going to look at the MRI scan and say, "Oh, that part's missing," or "that part's different," or like they look the same on a gross level. Um, and so MRI is not generally useful for diagnosis for a condition like FASD. It's really great for research because we do very subtle measurements and then we look at a
Yeah.
group scale. A group of kids with FASD have a smaller part here or a less connected part here than a group of kids without FASD. But on an individual level, you can't make those same statements.
How do you measure that? Okay, so you have multiple MRIs. What number are you checking for numbers, or are you looking at for color, like
Mhm.
different, like what do you
Yeah.
look at?
So MRI uses a magnetic field and radio waves to pick up signal from tissues in the brain. And it's a really powerful technique because there's a lot of different ways we can manipulate that signal. And by doing that, it's sensitive to different things. So ultimately, we're looking at numbers. We're looking at this signal that we get from the brain, but that signal can reflect different things. Sometimes that signal tells us how water's moving in the brain, how fast and how restricted it is. And that tells us about how the brain is structured and connected. Sometimes we can look at blood flow and then we can learn something about brain function via how the blood is flowing in
Is
the.
that a functional MRI or is that different?
Yeah, yeah. So functional MRI is sensitive to changes in blood oxygen. So when your brain is working in a particular location, your body sends a lot more oxygen to that place because
Cool.
it's working.
Cool.
And that's what functional MRI is sensitive to, is that change in oxygen.
And would that be beneficial for an individual on the spectrum?
Again, not as a routine sort of, not as a diagnostic
Got it.
tool.
Understood.
Yeah. It's super useful for research, and we
Cool.
can learn a lot about different ways that the FASD brain might process things or, you know,
So you're measuring things from the brain, you're
right.
manipulating the machine, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
doing cool things. And then there's data that is extracted from that.
That's right. Numbers. And so each person is going to have a number or a series of numbers that represents something. whether it's
Sure.
related to blood oxygenation or water flow
Right.
or
You're
volume.
like, trust me, dude, there's things,
Yep,
okay? Like,
numbers.
no, let me go in there. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
I mean, these are
I believe you.
numbers.
I believe you. No, that's a good way to say it
Yeah.
because you don't want to say a term and then everyone's like, 'cause then we're trying to follow,
Uh,
right? Yeah, it's true.
think about you go and get a bunch of blood tests and they're going to come back with numbers, right?
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
the same idea. And so on a big scale, those numbers are similar between typical and FASD. But when we look at really specific numbers and we look at a group level, we can often see differences that tell us something about potentially how alcohol is affecting
Okay.
the
Give
brain.
me one example
Of a measure.
and a number that told you something.
Yeah, so volume is probably an easy one to understand. So generally, kids with FASD have smaller brains at the whole brain level and when you look at specific regions. So the hippocampus, for example, is a region of the brain that's involved in memory, and that tends to be smaller in kids with FASD compared to neurotypical kids. It's not smaller in every kid with
Yep.
FASD. At a
Understood.
group level, we see smaller hippocampus overall, and that tells us something about how alcohol is probably affecting the hippocampus, and then how that might be related to memory.
Okay. And when you're doing this research, you're not trying to prove something that you think,
No
just like
confirmation bias.
letting
No,
the numbers and then trying to figure out what that means.
absolutely. And sometimes we find things that totally surprise us.
I know. Tell me again. Because you did, right?
We did, yeah. So let's say 10 years ago and before that, pretty much all of the brain imaging research in kids with FASD was older kids and adolescents. Okay. And I think we're missing a really critical age range in these younger kids, which is when a lot of the behavior problems start to come out, right? You start to
Yes, when
see the symptoms.
expectations start to increase, honest, and then obviously capacity is not catching up, and therefore, the gap, right? And as they
Yeah.
get older, the gap grow because the expectations do. Sorry.
So we wanted to know like what's going on in the brain of these younger kids, like 3 to 7 years old. What's happening in those brains? And does it look just like the older kids? And that's what we expected. We expected to find the same thing in these little kids that we see in older kids. And we actually found completely the opposite thing. So the younger kids had more connected brains. The alcohol exposed kids had more connected brains than the not exposed kids. Whereas all of the studies that had been done before that in older kids found less connected brains in FASD.
Okay. Well, so individuals on the spectrum at younger had more brain connection
That's right.
than those of neurotypical kids. Is that where the thinking theory tell me how then we get to it might grow faster in some places? Is
Mhm.
this where you
Yes.
and that was
So
what you learned, right?
exactly. And then so what we
Cool, man. How is that not the coolest?
right?
Yeah, like nerd out on I love that. I know
Yeah.
but I know moms, dads are listening going, yeah, tell us more because this informs their advocacy. This informs their own personal understanding, empathy, and intervention. That's how important your work is, man. Not only just numbers. And we need scientists and nerds and data geeks to do that because that's, it's in the numbers.
Mhm.
Awesome. Keep going. Sorry.
No, so I wanted to know, like, is what we found I wanted to connect what we found with what everybody else had found in older kids. So I wanted to know, like, how these link together and how to make sense of it all. So what we did is we brought those kids back. We looked at their brains again
Oh,
a
see, did
couple
we
years
miss
later.
something? Okay, geez,
So
keep
we're not just looking now at what does your brain look like at one point in time, but we're actually able to look at how that brain grows.
okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like,
Which is
that's
really cool,
incredible.
and it's really important. It's super important to understand how these brains grow because it tells you something very new that you don't have when you just look at it one time. It's
Yeah.
very important. So this was the interesting part because what we saw is that the kids with FASD, their brains were growing slower. So they started higher with more connectivity.
Right.
Then the brains were growing, but they were growing more slowly than the kids without exposure. And so the kids without exposure started lower, But by the end, like by the time they were 8, their brains were more connected
Got
than
it,
yeah,
got it. So they came out like a sprinter, shot
yeah.
out of the gate. This could then maybe explain some of the things we hear, like early on, hit all the milestones, sweet little kid, and then as they got older, expectations too, but people don't even know this, and you guys are just learning this, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
let's get back to that hope message. What does this tell us? This tells us that in fact there is a period of growth and development. I am careful with the term catch up, but for lack
Mhm.
of a better term, catch up doesn't necessarily mean catch up to neurotypical peers, right?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think there's a lot wrapped up in this, and there's a lot we still don't know, of
Agreed. Yeah,
course.
yeah.
But I one thing it suggests to me is that earlier interventions are gonna be more effective because the brain is a bit more susceptible to that.
Okay.
And also that intervention probably take a little bit longer in kids with alcohol exposure
Yeah,
than
like
kids
6
without.
months before you change something. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yes. The brain is just it needs more time
It
to
does.
wait.
It needs more exposure and experience to the repetition.
Yeah. And then there is, like I said, there is some evidence that development catches up to some extent later in later childhood and during the teen years. But I think we still need to learn a lot about that. You had asked me before about windows of opportunity, and this is a really nice idea. Like if we can pick the right time to provide support, is it going to be more effective, essentially? And
Yeah.
this is something we're still learning about.
Because if we go back a little bit, the study was mental health, right?
Hmm. So we've got a few different lines of research on
Yeah,
it.
that's
Yeah, so we've got one bit where we were looking at younger kids and data collection is complete for that part. So now we're really in the data analysis phase where we're trying to really understand what that data shows us. We've got another line of research in slightly older kids really looking at brain and mental health in FASD. And so that's longitudinal as well. We want to know how the brain is growing and we want to know how mental health is changing over time in kids. And we really want to understand why the rates of mental health challenges are so high in kids with FASD. And if we can understand at brain level why that is, and if we can understand at a brain level why some of the more standard mental health treatments are less effective in kids with FASD.
this blows the lid off things in terms of where we go and just trying to wrap your head around how awesome that is. And so what do you need to find that out? Like what's next like in your what to that next level, right? Or because you're still going through the initial data, so
Yeah.
you wouldn't know your next steps until that step is complete?
So we data collection takes a long time. We need a big group of participants to be able to detect the subtle changes that we're looking at. And this type of data collection takes a long time just to do, right? Families are coming in and they're giving us several hours of their
R
time.
and you are still recruiting currently for
That's
the
right.
mental health MRRA one if you
Yeah,
are in Calgary and or Edmonton.
that's right. Yeah. We're still recruiting kids with alcohol exposure.
Cool, we'll have that stuff on our website too, and you
Awesome.
shout it out.
So we're still recruiting, but we also like to look at data as we can so that we don't have to wait till the end of a study to learn anything useful, right? So we're looking at the data that we have already, and there's some interesting bits emerging. So, for example, we see depression problems more commonly in the kids that we're studying with alcohol exposure, whereas the levels of anxiety are pretty similar between the kids with alcohol exposure and the kids without.
Okay.
And then,
It's
really,
just then the capacity to manage that could be
yes,
compromised for individuals on the
yes,
spectrum because of the regulation and
totally.
executive
Yeah.
function. Okay.
And what's really interesting is we see different relationships between those depression symptoms and brain measures in the kids with FASD. So
Got it.
all of these things are rooted in the brain, right?
Right, yeah, okay.
And if you have a problem in your brain, it will manifest as a problem in behavior,
And a
right?
symptom. It's a symptom
Yeah.
of a neurological difference.
Exactly. So what's interesting is that with anxiety, okay, the people who have more anxiety, their brains are different than the people who have less anxiety. That sort of framework is the same in our study in the kids with and without FASD.
Got that.
So the
So
ones
totally
that have
get it.
had
So
yeah,
the basic overall arc of anxiety is the same in the control. Is the control the kids on the spectrum? Or is
the
it how
controls are kids without alcohol exposure.
okay, so the control was the kids without. Okay.
Yeah. So
Wow. Okay.
those look the same. So
Yes.
again, this is one study. You don't want to read too much into it, but what this suggests is like it's the same brain areas that are affected in the same way, driving these anxiety symptoms, no matter whether you have alcohol exposure or not.
Mhm.
I don't see that in depression. We see different relationships. So the parts of the brain are
Mhm.
differently related to depression symptoms in kids with and without alcohol exposure.
Do we know how is that showing up? Like, how are you measuring those differences?
So we've been looking at volume.
Okay.
And interestingly, in kids without alcohol exposure, we see kind of what you might expect. Smaller volumes in some really specific areas of the brain are associated with worse symptoms of depression. Okay. Right. The bigger that part of your brain is, sort of the better it's working and the less depression symptoms. That kind of makes sense.
Mhm. Yes, yes, yeah.
We see the opposite in the kids with ADHD. So actually, the bigger that part of their brain is, the worse their symptoms of depression.
So, I can picture you looking up from a piece of paper going,
Yeah.
"Where was that?" Right? Like, you can't say, "Call the authorities, it's not Godzilla." But what
Yeah.
are you spend most of your time in just perpetual, like,
Basically, this is my life. Yeah, it's basically.
yeah, like the
Huh?
data, triple checking. I mean, you brought
Yes.
kids back in.
Yes. And we're bringing these guys back in. So we don't have longitudinal data yet, like multiple,
Okay.
but we're getting there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is
Positive.
really important, right? So
Yeah.
every question we answer makes us ask 10 or 100.
Yeah. It's
Okay.
like
So
never
that's,
ends. When do you get
it
sad?
never,
How, as a researcher, what's the satisfying part of it then?
I mean, when you can figure out some of the story is always really exciting and
Putting the pieces
satisfying.
together,
Exactly. Like
and
the
of a
puzzle.
big, massive puzzle, right?
And it's a puzzle with no edges. Like there's just always,
Yeah, that's
right?
it's like
Mm,
video games as a service, right? It's always like the next quest,
yes.
and
Yeah.
then you think you're done, and then they're like, "Here's a DLC. Here you go. Purchase some
Totally.
more. Here's a new problem." Like when you're reading, and then you're like, "Well, that's a different question now I'm asking." Or,
Absolutely.
okay, let's talk about these questions.
Mhm.
Parents have questions. How can you tell the difference between a development of a neurotypical and individual on the spectrum? So how can you tell if it's FASD or if they're being asses sort of deal?
But I don't know, but if they find out, can they tell me how to understand
Yeah,
how the
tell your
children do?
kids
Yes.
too. Oh yeah, buddy, trust me.
Uh,
But like,
yeah.
how do
And
you how can because people, it comes down to also interpreting being
mhm,
taken
yeah.
advantage of and stuff. But in terms of on the science level,
Yeah. So on the science level, like from a data perspective, we need to look at lots of individuals multiple times to really properly tease this apart and understand not just what brains look like and how they change over time, but also the multitude of factors that in. So alcohol exposure is one factor and it's a super important
yes,
factor.
ma'am.
Absolutely. And all my data points to this, and I will say that forever. But there's other things that change and modify brain development as well, right? And so we have to think about those things too. Those are things like sex and age, but they're also things like postnatal environment or whether there were other prenatal exposures and then
Yeah, well,
right? Like
polysubstance
all of this
abuse,
stuff.
right?
Yep.
Yeah, there's it's never in alcohol is never in isolation. It's more, it's got a cocktail of stuff going because the individual is looking to reduce said pain. So interesting. That is interesting. So, okay, then as I say that, there are other factors, but then
Mhm.
there's also positive factors too.
Absolutely.
And what are some of those?
So we're looking at some like physical activity, but more, I think more relevant are like positive caregiving relationships postnatally, stable home placements,
Mhm.
good school environment. We haven't measured all of these, but these are things that matter
Sure.
and from
Even the community of practice did some initial work on
yeah,
that, about stable placements. How about the older for older kids because so the belief, not from everyone, parents they'll do this till they die, but the belief that my kid's older, what if they just got a diagnosis? Because people are listening to this 16, 17, 18, 20, 30. Now that it's becoming more prevalent, more adults are getting diagnosed. How can we make parents hopeful that the work they're putting in, it still matters that even if they're not young?
because the brain's always able to change. So that always matters. Like there's never so we talked a little bit about windows of opportunity. And
Yeah.
I don't want people to take the converse that there's a window of opportunity and nothing else matters. That's not what we're talking about at all. What we're talking about is times where things might be easier and faster to change, but the brain is still capable of changing across the lifespan. So it's always worth learning something new, trying something new, forming new habits when those are positive. It's always worth having positive experiences. And those will make a difference. Earlier, that's probably better, but that does not mean that later is not.
Yeah, it's like saving for retirement.
Yes,
Earlier is
exactly.
better, but you just gotta put more
Yes.
juice into the old
And
account, right? When
it's
it's like
better to start at 40 than never. Right?
uh-huh, yeah, because change, can happen quick too. Our
Yep.
guys are resilient, the brain
Yep.
adapts, it naturally wants to feel good, so when it is under less pressure and what do I mean by that? What's one of the takeaways here is about your expectations of a developmental trajectory for your kids. I've always stated that it looks different and it takes longer. It's like that silly putty and you stretch it out. That is development. But then it's also for parents to realize, okay, my kid hit out of the gate lots of milestones. Then, as more expected of his brain, and he wasn't able to, that's where we saw symptoms. But knowing even as an adult to make sure that the postnatal environment is good, we're working on strengths, and parent knows, okay, no way this is happening at 18. Settle in, you know, we're gonna do this. So then it doesn't seem like they're doing nothing because oftentimes it seems like nothing.
I know it can
Yeah,
take.
it's hard. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
oh yeah, yeah. I know you're like, oh, you're just saying what the science says.
Yeah.
And I understand there's a
Yeah.
very much the gray and the
Yeah.
implementation. And
Yeah.
for parents to know and have science behind that,
Yeah.
that's a big deal, right?
So we know that peak sort of brain values don't happen until the late 20s and 30s. So the brain is still developing during that time. It's still super important that there are positive, good experiences. Like I said, the brain can still change after that. You and I, we don't have all hope lost, Jeff. We can still learn
I
new
was gonna say we're after 40, what do we do now?
But, even when we think about the spectrum of brain development, that's still going into the 20s and 30s. So, being diagnosed at 18, you're only halfway through that development.
That's my point, dude. So you
Uh-huh.
hear how many times have you heard this where you met somebody, re-met somebody from high school, but in high school they were rebel
Mhm.
rousers, for to use my grandma's term, right? You know what I'm saying? They were
Oh,
partying
yeah.
out, they do. You were like, how are they gonna even make it to 20? But then you see them later 20s, early 30s, family, job, kids, and they say, "Oh, I grew up." No, 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 no. Your brain developed which
Mhm.
allowed you the maturation to
Mhm.
catch up and to make better decisions, right? So you're just as impulsive, but now since your brain has developed, it's just like, whoa, whoa, you got kids and a job, and that's it. Crush it, boom, right?
Yeah, and so people need to have the tools, right, to
Yeah.
develop safely, you know?
So yeah, and knowing in a space that it takes longer, and then if you could really do this. So okay, so how do people get a hold of you, and if they're in the area to actually do this, what's that process look like?
So if people are interested, that's phenomenal. They can contact our lab, brain MRI at ucalgary.ca is our email address. And so they can contact us there and we can tell them all about what the study entails. We can talk through whether it's a good fit for them, whether they're interested. We can answer any questions, all of that. There's no commitment by just touching base with us via email or phone. So we can walk through the whole process.
What's next, man? What are you doing? Like, you got lots of cooking up in the lab here.
You Yes. So
What?
we're gonna be chugging through the data that we have, really trying to extract as much information from it as we can. But we're also planning ahead for the next phase. And I think what I'd like to focus on is executive function and how that's rooted in the brain of kids with FASD and how that develops over adolescence.
Because that is the key to adulthood. It just makes so much sense because even with my own family, with my sister who would always talk the talk, I want to do this, but would never follow through. And people think that's a personal thing, but now when you understand that what she wanted to, she just didn't know how to shift the gear.
Yeah.
She used to say, Jeff, I could see the dishes, I just couldn't do them. She was a great mom, like, so when we could link the science to the symptoms and people see it in real term, and then they can make that
Mhm.
distinction. That means their intervention is different. It's empathy. It's not anger. We can help with all that other stuff. That's how important it is. And anyone in your lab, Dr. Lebel, should just listen to this because it is important. Because do you get bummed out? You're like, what the? Sometimes are you like,
Sometimes
what is this?
there's a lot of rejection in science. So we definitely have our low points. Yeah.
So rejection from what you expected the data to be, rejection
No,
from rejected. Yeah.
no, the data is fantastic. Rejection from getting grants or publishing papers or the students getting scholarships, those kinds of rejections. But
Yeah, oh, like the finding, because yeah, you
yeah,
have to find that.
whenever we connect back, honestly, whenever we connect back to the kids and the families, that boosts our spirits, reminds us
Yeah,
why we do what we do and why it's
dudes, for
important.
sure. Lots of comments because it is key. Because oftentimes you're looking at numbers,
Oh, yeah,
and
and we're geeks, like, we like numbers.
oh
It's
yeah,
just
for sure. But it's hard to, but there's people
totally.
behind it, right? So
Yeah,
it's good when
absolutely.
you
You
could
need yeah,
see that it's tangible in the workforce.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so we can say, we could wrap this up with our points that the brain of an individual on the spectrum differentiates from a neurotypical brain in ways that it could grow faster and then slower,
Mhm.
right? So start fast, sprint out of the gate, and then settle in for the long marathon.
Yes.
Where kids, neurotypical kids, like a little slower out of the gun, but would catch speed in the
Yeah.
momentum, right? Okay,
Yes,
great. So we could
exactly.
say that. There are multiple factors that are in play: prenatal exposure, prenatal trauma, right? Mom
Absolutely.
genetics,
Yep.
epigenetics, all that stuff, right? The prenatal environment significantly impacts brain development.
Yes, in
And
multiple ways. Yep.
the postnatal, so post baby environment really plays a factor because the brain is continuously growing.
Absolutely. Yep.
Symptoms, i.e., behaviors, are a reflection of the differences neurologically. Because when prenatal alcohol exposure meets the bloodstream in the brain, it affects the development of brain domains. These brain domains work together in synchronicity and talk to each other. So if there's impairment or breakdown structurally or chemically, then the interpretation somebody on the spectrum has of their environment is different. And so their outcomes might be viewed as willful, purposeful, intentional. It also makes them susceptible to mental health issues and, and some other factors.
Mhm.
But postnatal factor, postnatal experience, and it's never too late.
Never too late.
So it's never too late. So if grandma is listening to this, or if mom is listening to this and they have a kid in their 20s, 30s, or 40s,
Abs
it's not too late because what ends up happening is when we understand that this is brain difference and the science is telling us, right? Then we are able to interact, intervene, interject, and create better days and outcomes.
Yep. Late is better than never.
And you are going to keep drilling down, and your study is still open with
Yes,
the MRIs, and you and your team are continually asking more questions, answering more questions, and you love doing it, and you love connecting with the community.
totally.
Did I get that?
You got it all. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Oh, okay, cool. Okay. All right. So that is the big key. Now, are people able to read this study? Like, is it okay, if we put that on our blog, could people read it?
Yes, the scientific publications, you mean?
Yes, of what
Yes.
you're doing.
Yes,
Okay, so
absolutely.
we'll
So
put those on, and then we'll get a summary rocket, and
that's what I
then
was gonna say. We have summaries of some of them. You and I have worked on some of this before.
oh, that's right.
Yeah. And my
Okay,
lab has
cool.
worked on some of it. I think you and I did a podcast, didn't we? Going through one and, like, translating it from science.
Oh, cool. Let's keep doing that. Let's keep
Yeah.
doing that. You'll have to
So
forgive me my
absolutely.
memory and maybe then my executive functioning. Oh, where do you sit on that topic? Is memory a part of executive functioning or no?
I would call working memory part of executive function, yes.
Okay, cool. That's just I know that is a debate in the community, so I just want to know where you stood about that.
But
This
yeah,
has
we
been awesome. Go for it.
like, scientists in general, and I speak not just for myself,
Sure.
we love when people read our stuff. So, a lot of it's, behind paywalls and stuff like that, but if you ever want access to a study, just email the person that did it, and it will make their day. Like, seriously,
Yeah,
it will
yeah, yeah.
make their day. So, if parents are trying to access stuff and they're frustrated because they can't, and you have to be a
Yeah, yeah.
member of the university, just email people. They will love it. I love when people
Oh,
ask.
tip when someone's saying, "Hey, doctor,
Yeah,
let's do this." Man, good. I hope you're fired up because you really are doing some great work, and our audience loves what you do, and you put in the time because it gives them closure too, and just understanding that they could see the forest through the trees, and not just why are they like this? Why do they do this? And then conversely, they don't feel so alone and or like they're bad parents, because that's not the case. This is
no,
hard.
no, that's not what it is. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this is hard. Okay, cool. So you gave the website and all that good stuff. So we can't wait. I can't wait. You are kicking butt, your team's kicking butt, and of course, will you come back and do it again?
Of course.
You'll get the
Yeah.
John Goodman jacket, the SNL jacket at one point. I think it's just a
Excellent.
sticker, to be honest. But
Okay.
Catherine, Dr. Lebel, your team are awesome. We appreciate every time you're here. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, buddy.